The first ball of the Pemberton house party fell on the 23rd of April, and by the time the candles were lit in the long gallery, every guest in attendance had already read the morning edition of the Morning Herald. The column had not been kind. It had named her, which was unusual for a woman of no particular standing, and it had named her precisely. Miss Margaret Lacy, it read, formerly of Wiltshire, presently without means, had been observed in repeated proximity to His Grace the Duke of Harcourt at no fewer than 3 gatherings this season, and the paper's correspondent wondered, with the oiled politeness of a man paid to wonder, whether Miss Lacy's interest in the Duke was romantic or financial, though of course the two were so often the same thing in a woman of reduced circumstances. Margaret had read the column at 7 that morning, standing in the narrow room she shared with Mrs. Gillingham's trunks, and had set the paper down with a hand that did not shake, and had dressed in the same dove-gray silk Mrs. Gillingham had lent her for the season, and had pinned the small cameo brooch at her throat, the one that had been her mother's, the one the creditors had not taken, because it was worth less than £1. And sentiment was not a negotiable currency. She had come downstairs, and she had entered the gallery, and the room had looked at her, and she had felt every pair of eyes land and lift and land again, like starlings on a wire. Lady Pemberton stood near the mantelpiece with Miss Caroline Fenwick at her elbow, and the older woman's voice carried just far enough across the thinning crowd near the door. "The fortune hunter," Lady Pemberton said. And the words were not loud, not meant for the gallery at large, only for Caroline, only for the 3 women close enough to catch them, and that was enough. Caroline's mouth thinned into something that was not quite a smile. Margaret heard it. She had been meant to hear it. Across the room, Edward Ashworth, the Duke of Harcourt, stood with a glass of claret he had not yet tasted. He was watching the doorway. He had been watching the doorway since the music started, and when Margaret entered, his hand stilled on the glass, and his body went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with composure, and everything to do with recognition. He did not cross the room. He did not incline his head. He simply looked at her, and the quality of that looking was something the column had not accounted for and could not have described. If the way someone holds still in a room full of motion has ever told you something the rest of the room refused to say, you already know what was building in that gallery. Stay close. Margaret's father had died the previous August. Mr. Thomas Lacy, a gentleman of modest estate and immodest generosity, had kept a house near Marlborough and a library that outweighed his income by a factor the solicitors described, after his death, as regrettable. The debts totaled £2,400. The estate was sold, the books were sold, the horses were sold, and what remained after the creditors had been satisfied was £42, a trunk of her mother's linens, and the cameo brooch that sat now at Margaret's throat, like a small closed eye. There had been no family to claim her. Her mother's sister, Mrs. Gillingham, a widow of 73 with a house in Half Moon Street and a disposition that ran to kindness when she remembered to exercise it, had written a single letter offering Margaret a position as her companion for the season. The wage was £40 per annum, paid quarterly in arrears, and the duties were light, and the season was everything. Margaret had arrived in London in February with 2 dresses, a pair of gloves mended at the left thumb, and no expectation that the season would notice her. She was 24, which was old enough that the marriage market had already rendered its first verdict. She was pretty in the way that required a second look, dark-haired and serious-eyed, with a mouth that settled into patience rather than invitation. She was not a debutante. She was not an heiress. She was a gentleman's daughter living on a widow's charity, and the season had a word for women like that, and the word was unnecessary. Mrs. Gillingham, to her credit, had taken Margaret to every event the old woman's connections could secure, and it was at the Countess of Whitmore's card party in March that Margaret had first been introduced to the Duke of Harcourt. She had not known, at the time, that the tall, severe man with the gray eyes and the jaw that looked as though it had been cut from something harder than bone was the most eligible man in the room. She had known only that he had looked at her when she entered, and had not looked away when she caught him looking, and that his expression had not changed, and that this absence of change had felt, absurdly, like the most attentive thing anyone had done to her in months. 3 more encounters had followed across the next 6 weeks. A musicale at Lady Fenton's, where he had stood behind her chair for the duration of a sonata and said nothing. A promenade in Hyde Park, where Mrs. Gillingham had kneaded his arm across a muddy stretch of path, and Margaret had walked beside them, and he had adjusted his pace, without comment, to match hers. A supper at Lord Ashby's, where he had been seated at the far end of the table, and had, according to Mrs. Gillingham, who noticed everything, watched Margaret's hands as she spoke. The Morning Herald's correspondent had noticed the same hands, the same proximity, and had drawn the only conclusion the season permitted for a woman with 42 pounds to her name, and a duke across the room. The Pemberton house party lasted 4 days, and it was Lady Pemberton's particular theatre. She was Edward's aunt on his mother's side, a woman of 60, whose authority over her nephew's household had been absolute since the death of his wife 3 years prior, and whose plans for his second marriage had been public and particular for 2 seasons running. Miss Caroline Fenwick was the chosen candidate. Caroline was 21, fair, accomplished, connected to 3 separate earldoms through her mother's line, and possessed of an income of £6,000 per annum that made her, in Lady Pemberton's arithmetic, the only woman in England whose claim on Edward's attention was legitimate. Margaret's presence at the house party was an accident of Mrs. Gillingham's long friendship with Lady Pemberton's companion, Mrs. Aldridge, and Lady Pemberton had permitted it the way one permits a draught through a window one intends to close. The second morning of the house party, Margaret rose early and went to the small library on the ground floor, the one the family used for correspondence rather than display, and found Mrs. Aldridge sitting at the writing desk with tears on her face, and a letter crumpled in her lap. Mrs. Aldridge was 68, frail, and terrified of Lady Pemberton in the specific way that women who depend on other women's households for shelter learn to be terrified, and the letter, Margaret learned in the next quiet minutes, was from Mrs. Aldridge's daughter, who was ill and asking her mother to come. Lady Pemberton had refused. The house party required Mrs. Aldridge's presence, Lady Pemberton had said, and a daughter's fever was not sufficient cause for disruption. Margaret sat beside her and took the woman's hand, and said nothing for a full minute. And then she said, very quietly, that she would speak to Lady Pemberton herself. Mrs. Aldridge looked at her with the particular astonishment of a woman who had not been defended in 20 years. Margaret went to the morning room and told Lady Pemberton, in clear and level words, that Mrs. Aldridge ought to be permitted to visit her daughter, and that the house party would survive the loss. Lady Pemberton's eyes went hard. She said that it was not Margaret's place to manage another woman's household. Margaret said that it was not a matter of household, but of decency, and that she would be happy to assist Mrs. Aldridge's duties for the remaining days, if that would ease the inconvenience. Lady Pemberton dismissed her with a wave that was almost a slap. She did not know that Edward had been standing in the corridor outside the morning room with a letter of his own in his hand. She did not know that he had heard every word. She did not know that his hand had tightened on the paper in a way that had nothing to do with the letter and everything to do with the quality of her voice, when she had said the word decency, as though it were not an argument, but a fact she was simply reporting, the way one reports the weather or the time. That afternoon, Mrs. Aldridge left for her daughter's bedside in a hired carriage Margaret had arranged with 2 shillings from her own quarterly wages. The footman who carried Mrs. Aldridge's bag to the courtyard paused at the door and looked at Margaret with the careful, evaluating gaze of a man who had served this household long enough to know that kindness, in Lady Pemberton's house, was not a strategy anyone had tried before. Margaret did not notice him looking. She was watching the carriage pull away down the gravel drive, and her hand was at the cameo at her throat, and her face held the particular stillness of a woman who has done the right thing and knows it will cost her, and has done it anyway. Lady Pemberton said nothing about Mrs. Aldridge's departure at supper. She did not need to. Her silence carried its own arithmetic, and Margaret caught the older woman looking at her across the candles with an expression that had moved from irritation to calculation, and calculation, in Lady Pemberton's face, was a more dangerous thing than anger. That evening, Margaret overheard two of the housemaids in the corridor outside her room, their voices low and carrying. "Lady Pemberton says the Lacey girl arranged the whole business with the carriage," one of them said. "Says she is managing above her station. A fortune hunter with ideas, is what her ladyship called her." The words arrived through the closed door, and Margaret sat on the edge of her bed and absorbed them the way stone absorbs rain, without movement, without comment, without any outward sign that the water was finding its way into the cracks. The evening of the second day brought a concert in the long gallery. Caroline Fenwick sang an aria by Handel, and she sang it beautifully, her voice clear and confident and perfectly placed in the acoustics of the room, and the guests applauded with the warm satisfaction of people who are witnessing exactly what they expected to witness. Lady Pemberton turned to Lord Ashby's wife beside her and said, clearly enough for the nearest dozen guests to hear, "A woman of accomplishment and means, not a fortune hunter who mistakes proximity for invitation." The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples moved outward, and Margaret, seated at the back of the gallery with her hands folded in her lap and her mother's cameo at her throat, felt them arrive. She did not flinch. Her hand stayed still. The cameo caught the candlelight and held it. Edward, standing near the window with his arms folded across his chest, watched Margaret's hands. He watched them not move. He watched the stillness travel from her fingers up through her wrists and settle into her shoulders like something she had practiced so many times. It no longer required effort, and his jaw tightened, and he turned away. And the turning away was the loudest thing he had done in 2 days. Later that night, after the guests had retired, Margaret walked the corridor toward her room and past the portrait gallery, and through the open door she saw Edward standing alone before a small painting she had not noticed before. It was a portrait of a young woman with fair hair and a high collar, and eyes that looked, even in oil, as though they had just finished laughing. Edward's hand was at his breast pocket, pressing something flat against his chest through the fabric of his coat, and his face, in the candlelight, was not the face of a man with a secret. It was the face of a man with a wound. She stepped back. She did not let her shoe sound on the floor. She returned to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her thumb against the cameo at her throat, and understood, without knowing the specifics, that the cold man the season had handed her was not cold. He was broken in a place that coldness protected, and the protection was so thorough that most people, including the correspondent for the Morning Herald, had mistaken it for the man himself. The portrait was Charlotte, Edward's wife, who had died 3 years ago in the winter of 1811, in a house in Derbyshire, in a room Edward had not reached in time. She had written him a letter in the last hours, a single page in a hand that grew less steady as it continued, telling him that the child was coming early, and that she was not afraid, and that he should know, in case the letter arrived before he did, that the sound of his name was the last comfortable thing she expected to hear. The letter had arrived after. The child had not survived. Edward had carried the letter folded in his breast pocket for 3 years, and it had worn thin at the creases. And he had not read it again after the first time, and he had not put it away. Lady Pemberton knew about the letter the way she knew about everything in Edward's household. She had told him, on 3 separate occasions, that grief was a season, and that seasons ended, and that Caroline Fenwick was the appropriate next chapter. Edward had said nothing each time, which Lady Pemberton had interpreted as agreement, and which was, in fact, the sound of a door being held shut from the inside. Margaret did not know any of this. She knew only the shape of his hand against his breast pocket, and the shape of his face in the candlelight, and the shape of the silence that had filled the portrait gallery like cold water, filling a room from the floor up. The 3rd day of the house party broke warm and bright, and Margaret spent the morning in the garden with Mrs. Gillingham, who was tired and whose ankles ached and who wanted to sit on the stone bench by the fountain and talk about the roses. The garden was Lady Pemberton's particular pride, clipped and ordered and patrolled by a gardener whose shears could be heard from the terrace, and Margaret sat in her dove-gray silk with the cameo at her throat and listened to Mrs. Gillingham describe the roses her late husband had kept at their country house. And the listening was easy because Mrs. Gillingham asked nothing in return except presents, and presents was the one thing Margaret could still afford to give. Edward appeared on the gravel path at 10:30, walking with the measured stride of a man who had somewhere to be and had chosen, for reasons he would not have been able to articulate, to be here instead. He stopped at the bench. He looked at Mrs. Gillingham and inclined his head. He looked at Margaret, and something shifted behind his eyes, a small rearrangement of light and shadow that was not a smile and was not an invitation, and was, nevertheless, the most specific thing anyone had offered her since the column had been published. Margaret's pulse moved in her wrist, a small betrayal, and she folded her hands in her lap so the movement would not show. "Come inside," he said. "The sun will be too strong within the hour." Margaret looked at Mrs. Gillingham, who was perfectly comfortable and who waved her off with the cheerful authority of a woman who understood exactly what she was seeing. Margaret stood and walked with Edward across the gravel and through the garden door and into the cool corridor beyond, and his hand found her elbow for the space of 3 steps, guiding her past a low threshold, and the touch lasted no longer than the threshold required, and her skin remembered it for the rest of the day. She was aware, with the exactness that the body imposes on the mind, when the mind would rather not know, of the precise distance between his shoulder and hers as they walked, and of the way that distance held steady, governed by a discipline she could feel without seeing. "Eat something," he said, nodding toward the breakfast room where the sideboard was still laid. "Mrs. Gillingham will not have reminded you." "I am not hungry, Your Grace." "You are pale," he said, and his voice was level, and the observation carried the weight of a command. And Margaret ate something, and did not look at him while she did, and felt his presence in the room the way one feels a fire at one's back, specific and warm, and impossible to ignore. He did not sit. He stood near the door with his arms at his sides and watched her eat, and the watching had a quality she could not name, protective and specific, and entirely at odds with the man the season believed him to be. When she finished, he said, "Walk with me." And she did, and they walked the length of the east corridor without speaking, and the silence between them was not awkward, and was not cold. It was the silence of 2 people who had recognized something in each other and had not yet found the language for it, and the corridor smelled of beeswax and rain, and the light through the tall windows lay in long, pale panels on the floor, and Margaret's hand, at her side, was close enough to his that the heat of his skin reached the back of her knuckles without the skin itself touching. If you have ever felt the precise temperature of someone's nearness and understood it as the truest sentence they had spoken, you know what was happening in that corridor. What came next would test whether the truth could survive the season's verdict. That evening, the house party's third, the disaster arrived in print. A footman brought the evening edition to the drawing room on a silver tray, and Lord Ashby's son, a young man of 22 who enjoyed cruelty the way some men enjoy cards, read the relevant passage aloud before anyone could stop him. The passage was longer this time. It named Margaret by her full name, Margaret Ann Lacey, and it named her father's debts, and it named the precise sum of £2,400, and it named the Duke of Harcourt as the object of her pursuit, and it concluded with a sentence that was framed as a question and functioned as a verdict. Was the Duke aware, the correspondent wondered, that the woman at his elbow this season was the same woman whose father had died, owing half the county, and whose present position as a paid companion rendered her, by any honest measure, a fortune hunter dressed in borrowed silk? The room went still. Margaret's hand found the cameo at her throat. She pressed it once, the way one presses a wound to stop the bleeding. "There it is," a voice said from the far side of the room. The wife of a minor baronet Margaret had not spoken to once in 3 days. The fortune hunter, confirmed in print. Margaret stood. She did not look at Edward. She did not look at Lady Pemberton. She looked at the baronet's wife, at the woman who had spoken. And her voice, when it came, was steady and clear, and carried no anger, and no plea, and no apology. "My father owed £2,400 when he died," Margaret said. "He owed it because he lent money to people who needed it, and kept no record, and asked for no return. I am his daughter. I have £40 a year, and a cameo that was my mother's, and the clothes I'm wearing belong to someone else." She paused. The room held its breath. "I have not pursued anyone in this room. I have attended the events my employer was invited to, and I have spoken when spoken to, and I have not once, in 6 weeks, pretended to be anything other than what I am." She walked to the door with her back straight and her chin level and her shoes silent on the carpet. And she left the room, and the room watched her leave. No one spoke. The clock on the mantelpiece filled the silence with its small, precise ticking. And the ticking sounded, in the wake of what Margaret had said, like the steady, measured beat of something that had been true for a long time and had simply been waiting for someone to say it aloud. She went to her room and sat on the bed and pressed her hands flat against her knees and breathed. The cameo was warm against her throat from the heat of her own skin. She did not cry. Crying was a luxury that required an audience or a future, and she had neither. She had £40 per annum, and a reputation the morning papers had dismantled in 3 paragraphs, and a borrowed dress that smelled faintly of Mrs. Gillingham's lavender, and she had the specific small knowledge, lodged beneath her ribs like a splinter, that the way Edward Ashworth had looked at her across the breakfast room that morning had been the truest thing she had encountered since her father's funeral, and that it did not matter now, because the season had named her, and the season's names were final. There was a knock at her door. She opened it and found Mrs. Gillingham standing in the corridor with her traveling case already packed. "We leave in the morning," Mrs. Gillingham said. "Before breakfast. I will not have you sit in that dining room again. You do not need to leave on my account." "I am leaving on my account," Mrs. Gillingham said, and her old eyes were bright and fierce. "A woman who defends another woman's right to see her sick daughter is not a fortune hunter, and I will not stay in a house that pretends otherwise." Margaret took the old woman's hand and held it, and the holding was the closest she came to breaking. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that Edward had left the drawing room 30 seconds after she had. He had walked to the study at the end of the east wing, and he had sat at his desk, and he had taken the folded letter from his breast pocket and laid it on the leather surface and looked at it for a long time. Charlotte's handwriting, the crease worn almost through. He had carried it for 3 years as proof that he had failed a woman who trusted him, and the proof had become the wound, and the wound had become the wall, and the wall had kept every living woman at a distance that Lady Pemberton had mistaken for availability, and that was, in fact, the perimeter of a grief he had not finished. He touched the letter with one finger. He thought of Margaret's hands in the drawing room, pressed against the small cameo, holding still while the room collapsed around her. He thought of her voice in the morning room, saying the word decency as though it were simply what existed. He thought of the way she had eaten breakfast because he had told her to, not because she was obedient, not because she was grateful, because she had read the concern inside the command and had honored it, and no one had read him that accurately in 3 years. He stood. He folded the letter and returned it to his pocket. He rang for his man and instructed him to send for Mr. Hale, the solicitor, who was staying at the inn in the village 3 miles distant, and to have him at the house by 8 o'clock in the morning. He instructed him to prepare a special license, which Edward, as a peer, had the standing to obtain, and which Mr. Hale, who had served the Ashworth family for 30 years, would know how to arrange on short notice. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the study with the letter on the desk and the candle burning down and his hand open on the arm of the chair. And the hand, had anyone been there to see it, was perfectly still. Dawn came pale and cold through the study windows, and Edward washed and dressed and went downstairs and found the house already stirring. The guests would breakfast at 9. Lady Pemberton would preside. Caroline Fenwick would sit at her right hand. The morning's conversation would be about the column, about Margaret, about the fortune hunter who had overreached and been exposed, and the conversation would be settled and satisfied and final. Margaret came downstairs at 7:30 with her bag packed and Mrs. Gillingham on her arm. She wore the dove-gray silk for the last time and the cameo at her throat, and her face was composed in the particular way of a woman who has decided that the act of leaving with dignity is the last principled thing available to her. She crossed the front hall toward the door. Edward was standing at the foot of the stairs. "Miss Lacey," he said, "will you come to the breakfast room?" It was not a question. Margaret looked at him and saw something in his face that she had not seen before, a stillness that was not cold, a certainty that was not arrogant, a quality of attention so specific and so steady that it felt, for one disorienting moment, like the gaze of a man who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the world to arrive at the place where he had been standing all along. "Your Grace, Mrs. Gillingham and I are leaving." "I know," he said. "Come to the breakfast room first." Mrs. Gillingham looked at Edward. Edward looked at Mrs. Gillingham. Something passed between them that Margaret did not catch, and Mrs. Gillingham squeezed Margaret's arm and released it and said, "Go, my dear. I will wait here." Margaret went. The breakfast room was full. Every guest of the house party had come down early, summoned, Margaret would learn later, by a note slipped under each door at 6 o'clock that morning in Edward's own hand. Lady Pemberton sat at the head of the table with Caroline Fenwick at her right, and Lord Ashby's cruel son at her left, and the minor baronet's wife across from her. And the table was set, and the silver was polished, and the room was the same room where Margaret had eaten breakfast yesterday, because a man with gray eyes had told her she was pale. Mr. Hale stood by the window with a leather case under his arm. He was a small man with kind eyes and ink on his cuff, and he nodded at Edward as they entered. Edward walked Margaret to the center of the room. He released her elbow. He turned to face the table, and the table looked at him, and the room went so quiet that Margaret could hear the clock on the mantelpiece marking the seconds. "I have an announcement," Edward said. Lady Pemberton's hand tightened on her teacup. Edward did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Miss Lacey became the Duchess of Harcourt at 9 o'clock this morning." The sentence fell into the silence like a key into a lock. It turned, and the room changed. Lady Pemberton's teacup met its saucer with a sound that was almost a crack. Her mouth opened, and what came out was not the polished sentence she had prepared for every contingency her arithmetic had measured. What came out was, "You cannot, Edward. You cannot have." And the fragments piled against each other like ice against a bridge, finding no purchase. Caroline Fenwick's face went white, then still. She looked at Margaret, and Margaret saw in her eyes not hatred, not fury, not the theatrical collapse the season's gossip would later invent, only the slow, specific recognition of a woman who had been told her entire life she was the answer, and who was now confronting the fact that the question had never been hers. "Mr." Hale stepped forward and opened the leather case and laid the special license on the table, signed and witnessed and sealed, and the document sat among the breakfast things like a stone dropped into a bowl of cream, heavy and undeniable. Lord Ashby's son, who had read the column aloud the night before, looked at the license, and then at Edward, and then at Margaret, and closed his mouth. The minor baronet's wife pressed her napkin to her lips. Edward turned to Margaret. His eyes, the gray of them, the smoke and granite of them, were open in a way she had never seen, every wall down, every distance cancelled, and when he spoke again, his voice was low and meant only for her, though the room heard it all the same. "Margaret," he said. Her given name. The first time he had used it. The sound of it in his voice was like a door opening onto a room she had not known existed. Warm and lit and furnished with things she had believed were no longer made. She looked at him, and her eyes were bright, and her hand went to the cameo at her throat. And this time, the press of her thumb against the small carved face was not a wound held closed. It was an anchor touched in confirmation. Lady Pemberton stood. Her chair scraped against the floor, a sound so raw and uncontrolled that it silenced even the clock. She looked at Edward. She looked at Margaret. She opened her mouth, and what came out was quieter than Margaret had expected. Quieter and smaller, and threaded with something that might, in a different woman, have been the first breath of shame. "You might have told me," Lady Pemberton said. "I am telling you now," Edward said, and his voice held no cruelty, no triumph, only the level factual tone of a man who had made the correct decision and required nothing from the room except its witness. The season's machinery, which had built its case against Margaret Lacey across 6 weeks of columns and whispers and the specific gravity of 2,400 pounds of inherited debt, met the single sentence of a duke who had chosen otherwise, and the machinery lost. It lost not because Edward's rank outweighed it, though it did, and not because the special license was unimpeachable, though it was. It lost because every person at that table had seen Margaret Lacey defend a frightened old woman's right to visit her sick daughter, and had heard her say the word decency as though it required no defense, and had watched her walk out of the drawing room the night before with her back straight and her chin level and her borrowed silk whispering against the carpet, and every person at that table, in the small, honest place beneath the season's arithmetic, had known what the column had refused to print. Mr. Hale gathered the license and returned it to his case. Caroline Fenwick excused herself with a sentence so controlled it sounded rehearsed, and Margaret, who might have felt triumph and who might have felt vindication, felt instead a strange, quiet tenderness toward the woman who had been promised something the world had not been authorized to give. The following week, Margaret and Edward returned to his estate in Derbyshire. The house was called Hartfield, and it sat at the head of a valley where the river dove bent through meadows that had been green since before the house was built. It was large and old and cold in the corridors, and warm in the rooms where fires had been kept. And the staff, who had known Edward since he was a boy, and who had mourned Charlotte with him, and who had watched him close himself into the study with the folded letter for 3 winters running, lined the front hall when Margaret arrived and looked at her with the cautious, hopeful eyes of people who had been waiting for something they had stopped believing would come. The housekeeper, Mrs. Price, curtsied and said, "Welcome home, Your Grace." And the words landed on Margaret with a weight she had not expected, because she had not been addressed by any title since her father died, and the last home she had known had been sold to pay his debts. The first morning, Margaret woke early and went to the library on the ground floor, the small one that smelled of leather and lamp oil, and resembled, in its proportions and its quiet, the library her father had loved and lost. The shelves held volumes her father would have recognized, the same poets, the same historians, the same natural philosophers whose spines she had traced with her finger as a girl in Wiltshire. Edward was already there. He was standing by the window with the folded letter in his hand, and the morning light was pale on his face. And when Margaret entered, he looked at her, and then at the letter, and then at the table by the window, and he placed the letter on the table. Carefully, the way one places something down when one has decided it can be set down at last. "Charlotte wrote it," he said. "The night she died." Margaret said nothing. She stood in the doorway and waited. "I have carried it for 3 years," he said. "I carried it because I believed I owed her that. I still believe it." He looked at Margaret, and his eyes were clear. "I will not put her away. She is part of this house. She is part of me." "I would not ask you to," Margaret said. The letter remained on the table by the window, and in the weeks that followed, Margaret sometimes saw Edward touch it as he passed, a brush of his fingertips across the worn fold, and she understood that the touch was not grief, but gratitude, the kind that lives inside a man who has been permitted to hold 2 truths without being asked to choose between them. Spring settled into the Derbyshire hills. The garden came alive in stages. First the crocuses along the south wall, then the daffodils in the meadow below the terrace, then the roses Mrs. Aldridge's daughter, now recovered, sent as cuttings from her own garden with a note that said simply, "For the woman who sent my mother home." Margaret planted them beneath the library window with her sleeves pushed to her elbows and the dirt cold under her fingernails, and the cameo brooch sat on the sill above her, catching the late afternoon light. A copy of the Morning Herald arrived each week, and Edward left it unread on the hall table, and Margaret walked past it without comment, and the paper yellowed and curled and was eventually taken away by the footman, and neither of them mentioned it, and the not mentioning was its own kind of justice, quiet and complete. That evening, Edward found her in the library reading aloud from a book of verse she had discovered on the shelf, and he sat in the chair across from her and listened, and the fire cracked, and the snow, which had come late and unexpected that April, fell past the window in slow, deliberate flakes, and the room was warm, and the letter lay folded on the table between them, and the cameo lay on the sill above the new roses, and the house, which had been a monument to what had been lost, became in the particular silence of 2 people choosing each other in the same room, a place where what had survived was finally enough. Thank you for staying until the end. If Margaret's story moved you, leave a quiet word and come back soon.